Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator Reynolds.
Thank you very much, Acting Deputy President. God forgives, the CFMEU does not. Now, that might be all over the media this week, tattooed around the neck of the CFMEU thug John Setka. So while it's around his neck, along with all of his other bikie tattoos and symbols, it is tattooed in the hearts and emblazoned on the minds of all CFMEU officials. Make absolutely no mistake of that. It's tattooed on some of their bodies, on their T-shirts, their hoodies, their bumper stickers, their flags, along with the slogan, "Whatever it takes." And it's not whatever it takes legally, it is simply whatever it takes in any way possible to achieve their means. These two statements taken together summarise the CFMEU in every way that is abhorrent to the values of Australians, that is abhorrent and contrary to the laws of our land and to our ethics and to our morals. Yet those opposite not only have turned a blind eye, they have taken active steps to encouraging and allowing this behaviour to flourish once again. Now, at CFMEU, there is no question that for many years those opposite, and in fact most Australians who read the paper, watch the news, will know that the CFMEU has been is consumed, is riddled with criminals and bikies. It's going about its daily business, using bikies to intimidate and to threaten other hard-working Australians on work sites and building sites right across this country. It is unacceptable, yet those opposite know it, they facilitate it and they encourage it. Well, this is the day and this is the bill to say enough is enough. This is not something we are going to walk past anymore. It is not something we're going to turn a blind eye to simply because they have contributed over $6 million in campaign assistance to the Australian Labor Party. 13 pieces of silver, which is costing our nation dearly. And in Western Australia, we have Unions WA saying, "Oh, there's nothing to see here. Come back to us when you've got credible evidence." We've got the Premier saying, "Oh, well, there was some problems, but they're historical problems. Let's not worry about that." Well, I tell you what, that is cowardice and that is not leadership. In WA, we are clearly now being taken back to the bad old days of the 1980s, and Labor federally and state are actively encouraging and letting this happen to appease, to appease their union mates. But they are not just mates, they are their national masters. And even today in the West Australian, which has been full for years of stories about bikies and their associations with trade unions movements, particularly the CFMEU, today they have absolute evidence of this, yet the Premier and Unions WA are saying, and Minister Watt are saying, "Yeah, nothing to see here. We'll introduce this almost ineffective, or completely ineffective actually, as it currently stands, legislation." So I would implore every West Australian and every West Australian senator in this place to go and read the West Australian today and just to see how pervasive bikies still are in the CFMEU. Now, the CFMEU doesn't have bikies on their payroll to bake cakes for them, to give them a ride on their Harley-Davidsons. They have them in there to intimidate and to conduct criminal activities on their behalf. Now, in Western Australia, it is particularly of concern, and it shouldn't just be of concern to Western Australians, to those who are working in our mine sites across our state. Because the harder you make it for West Australian workers and West Australian mining companies in particular, that impacts on the rest of the nation and how we can afford to pay for our education, our health, our criminal justice system. So let me give you some examples of what's been happening in Western Australia. Just this week on BHP mine sites, we've had unions turning up unannounced to start holding our state's economy to ransom. And the CME West Australia Chief Executive Officer Rebecca Tompkinson has said, "It is unthinkable that at this critical juncture of WA's role in the energy transition, if the unions, the militant unions, send us backwards." The Minerals Council of Australia has said this move is of grave concern to the Australian economy. And along with this chaos in the mining and construction industries, Fremantle Port, the port itself, is facing 2 days of closures this weekend when workers work off the job to demand an incredibly large pay increase, another one. WA's union crisis is slowly turning Australia into a state of the union. And this blast from the past, the bad old days from the 1980s, which we had hoped in Western Australia and nationally would never return, is coming back, and all too quickly, facilitated by those opposite who currently reside on the government benches. So what's Labor's role in all of this? This bill is a direct result of them rolling over to the CFMEU and abolishing the ABCC, the Australian Building and Construction Commission. The only beneficiaries of that were the CFMEU. It was certainly not to the benefit of Australian workers, to Australians who are struggling already to afford to build houses, to afford their mortgages and to get themselves into their own homes. This legislation has come about squarely because of this abolition of the ABCC. And as a result of that, surprise, 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 what's happened? We've seen a significant increase in criminal activity, in threats, in corruption, in bribery, in intimidation, violence, bullying, standover tactics, misappropriation of funds, theft, and other accusations of lawlessness by the CFMEU right across the construction sector. Again, hardly a surprise. Those opposite can't possibly credibly claim that when they got rid of the ABCC, that surprise, surprise, John Setka and the CFMEU officials and their bikies would not revert to type. And of course they have. Now, the Albanese government knew this was happening, they were warned this would happen, but they abolished it anyway. And it has to, we believed, and we still believe, that there should have been an inquiry into this bill to hear from the department, from the Fair Work Commission and the building sector itself on how this bill would operate. That is the role of this place. That is the role of this Senate. And yet again, the government is denying the Senate the opportunity to do our job. Now, Minister Watt himself has spent his entire time in this place being the CFMEU's biggest cheerleader. At Senate estimates, I remember quite clearly how he would mercilessly attack the building regulator who dared hold his mates at the CFMEU to account. To the law of this land, he achieved his lifelong dream in abolishing the ABCC and giving John Setka, a most despicable human being, control of the construction sector here in Australia. So make no mistake that this legislation is a direct result of not just the incompetence of those opposite, but also because they could not stand up and be leaders and govern for all Australians and stand up to the worst of the worst in the trade union movement, the CFMEU. Now, I think there is no question that the PM made this choice to change workplace laws because he got $6.2 million from them, his mates and his comrades in the CFMEU. Unfortunately, all Australians are now paying the price for this. The CFMEU construction division was bad before, even under the ABCC. But under this government, in a couple of short years, they have taken their lawlessness, their bikie activities, their intimidation to a whole new level. And what does this cost Australians? What does it cost Western Australians? Australians are now paying 30% more on major projects, on their homes and on other buildings, on infrastructure generally. And why does that matter to them? It's not just about their own home. It's because the money, their taxpayer dollars, is getting 30% less infrastructure for hospitals, roads, and all other vital infrastructure. So, in relation to this legislation, the Albanese government is not telling the truth when it says that this legislation will clean up the scandal-plagued construction sector. There are more holes in this legislation than probably you'd look at a piece of Swiss cheese. It rather conveniently provides the minister, the CFMEU's chief cheerleader, with far too much power and discretion. And with a stroke of a pen, their biggest cheerleader can end the administration early. For example, heaven forbid if Labor are re-elected, they could end the administration the day after the election. Not surprisingly, the bill doesn't talk about any links between $6.2 million of donations to the Labor Party and future donations to the Labor Party. In fact, this bill is so weak it could well have been written by John Setka himself, and maybe it was. What we also need to amend in this bill is to ensure that the administrator will apply this administration will apply to all of the CFMEU's construction divisions, not just a select few. It must apply to Western Australia. And if Unions WA and if Premier Cook do not think that there is any contemporaneous evidence of CFMEU malfeasance, bullying, intimidation, corruption and bikie affiliations, they are completely and utterly willfully blind. Just look at the West Australian today for evidence of that. Currently, this bill sunsets after 3 years, regardless of what may or may not have been achieved by the administrator. But this legislation also must, by our amendment, to make sure that political donations cannot be made by the CFMEU, or they cannot run political campaigns on behalf of any political party here in this country. This legislation was brought on by the Labor Party abolishing the ABCC and deliberately allowing the CFMEU to run riot. They've been forced into this legislation, but they've presented legislation that will have no practical impact, and that the chief cheerleader of the CFMEU and supporter over the years can, with a single stroke of the pen, at any time, end the administration. This is not leadership. This is not political courage. This is the basest of all political actions and expediency. This country deserves so much better than this bill, and it is so important. We have to set the standard in this place, and where we see corruption, where we see thuggery, where we see intimidation, where we see a real and practical impact on the Australian economy, on Australian home buyers, everybody in this chamber has to stand up and say the law applies to us all, to all Australians. It is time to accept
Thank you, Senator Reynolds.
amendments.